Hey guys and gals, welcome to day 4. Yesterday we learned all about objects. Before we get started on day 4, let's dive into a review of the assignment from day 3. So here I am in REPL.it looking at the assignment from yesterday. So this is our battleship factory. This returns battleships. This function here, and we'll go over all of this, this checks if a guess that is made, like if I say I fire at B7, it will let us know if we hit a ship at B7. And then down here we're just creating the ships. See, I use the const keyword. You can use var if you want, because that's what I showed you to use. I like to use const because I know I'm not going to reassign these variables. Use whatever's preferable to you. So I run this and I am going to look at ships. We see it's an array with 3 ships. And each ship has an ID, an X coordinate, a Y coordinate. We set those when we passed them into the factory, creating the ships. And then they each have this method, guess position. And guess position is how we're going to take a shot at a battleship and guess if we hit it or not. We're going to find out if we hit it. So come up to our battleship factory, and I'll show you how this function works. Basically, we call the method and we pass in something like B7. So X would be the letter B, and the Y parameter would be the number 7. And depending on what we passed in originally to create the battleship for coordinate y and coordinate x, which are now set to this dot x and this dot y, well, if the user's guess, if their guess of x equals this dot x, which is coordinate x, and their guess of y equals this dot y, which is coordinate y, then it returns a hit. Otherwise, it returns a miss. Up here, I created a count that is incremented each time, and that's how I get the unique IDs on each of my battleships. I don't want to dive deep into this, but essentially, every time the battleship function is called, we know there is a context, a this context. This points to battleship, because it's pointing to the function. So unlike if I had created a var count equals 0, which would be deleted or removed or vanish, or it's just gone every time the function's done running and it's created again every time the function is ran again. Well, this dot count gets stored onto the actual function object. And if you come over here, I can show you that battleship factory, it's a function, but it's also an object. It has properties, so I can treat it like an object. Length is the number of arguments, so I can just give it a property, like whatever equals awesome. And now battleship factory has that property, whatever awesome. Okay, so what I did here was I just said that this dot count is either equal to this dot count, so it's equal to itself, unless it doesn't exist, in which case, if we did battleship factory count over on the right, we see it's undefined. Well, what happens when you do undefined or 1? You get 1. Undefined or 10, you get 10. Undefined or 0, you get 0. So that's what's happening. JavaScript evaluates this side of the equation because it always evaluates the right side of an equal sign. And this evaluates to 0 if this dot count is undefined, which it is. So this dot count is 0. When we increment it here, it becomes 1. And then every time we call battleship factory, it just continues to be incremented. That's not important though. What is important is we end up returning this battleship object. Let's look at our ships. And on the battleship object, so when we call the guess position function, this doesn't refer to the function anymore. It refers to the object. So this is a tough thing to get at first. Once you get it, it's like so simple. But at first, you need to understand that. So when we call this function, this is equal to the Battleship factory function. But when we call this function, this is equal to this object. Okay? And that's how we check if we get a hit. So come down to does guess hit any ships? And let's run this and let's call this. Does guess hit any ships? We pass in ships, and then we'll make a guess object. And since I know one of the ships does indeed have coordinates A5, we hit enter and we see we have a direct hit on ship 1. If we had done B5, that wouldn't have happened. It'd be false. And the way this works is we pass in the ships and a guess, and then we just loop through the ships. So we have this variable I, and then while it's less than ships.length, we increment it. So we do a loop for every ship in the array. Again, I use const. You can use var. We just store the current ship to this variable. And then, since the ship is an object, if we console.log ship and we run it, we can see it loops through each ship. However, this is the correct guess with A5. We see as soon as we get a direct hit, the function returns true, right? Because it calls guess position on that ship. It passes in the X from our guess, which was A, the Y, which was 5. It calls this function on the ship. And since X is equal to this dot X and Y is equal to this dot Y, it returns hit. And we just test. We store it to hit or miss. And then we test if hit or miss equals hit. If it does, we say direct hit on ship. We print the ship ID and we return true. So something cool that I'll just do real quick, and you could probably think of other cool things to add. We can make a variable called guesses and set this to 3. And a variable called lost, or player lost. And we'll set this to true. Well, why don't we make it player 1 and we'll set it to false. And so every time this function is called, we will remove a guess. Okay? Don't do this inside the loop. If we did it inside the loop, then every ship would count as a guess. And that's not true, because when we fire a shot, we're not firing 3 different shots. We're firing one shot, but we have to check all 3 ships to see if we hit any of them. So make sure you don't put guesses minus minus in the loop. And we could just check before taking the shot. If guesses is less than or equal to 0, then the game's over. And we could say console log game over. And we'll say U, and then we want to say if we won or lost. So we'll check if player won, then we'll put you won, and if they didn't, then we'll put lost. And then of course we don't want to shoot the missile, so we'll just return. Doesn't matter what we return. Now let's check this. So if we have no more guesses, the game's over. We log a message. Now we still have to make sure that if we get a hit, we change player 1 to true, because player 1 is equal to false. That's 1 as in WON. Let's run this, and let's try to take some guesses we know are wrong. A6, We don't need to log that out. A6 is wrong. We know A9 is wrong. And let's try C9. Wrong. So what happens if we try again? It tells us game over, we lost. Let's run this one more time. That's an incorrect guess. Let's just go for A5. We know that's correct. Direct hit on ship 1. And if we try to call the function again, doesn't matter what we call it with. See, it keeps going. So what we're going to have to do is make another variable, game over, or actually, so if the player won, then we don't need to continue. So how about we just say if player won, or they don't have any more guesses, then we show them the game over. So let's try this again. We miss. Now we're going to hit. And now if we try to call it again, we see game over, we won. If you wanted to improve on this, you can make it so that this message appears before we try to take another shot, because it would make sense if you won the game that you'd know before you took your next guess. So there's tons of different ways you could have done this. This is just one of them.